All right, here we go. We're live streaming now on Facebook. So hello, everybody out there in Facebook world. This is Kate White with Kimberly and Johnson. We're here just talking about her upcoming book and various webinars and book clubs. And gosh, so many new things that you've got going on. Kimberly, why don't you just tell people for a moment all the good stuff you've got going on?
Sure. So my new book, The Call of the Wild, How We Heal Trauma, Awaken Our Own Power and Use It for Good. It's coming out in 3 weeks. It's available for pre-order. It comes out April 13th. And so in honor of that release, there's all kinds of things going on, including a book club. You can download the first chapter for free at kimberlyandjohnson.com/chapter. Everyone was like, don't give away the first chapter. That's where all the good stuff is, because of course, the whole book is good, I think. But the first chapter is where a lot of the graphic illustrations are and the frameworks going forward. It's kind of an overview of a digestible version of polyvagal theory and how connective tissue is involved and how our sex is involved in that. So if you're interested and you just want to check it out first, you can go and read the first chapter.
Yeah, that was a really great chapter. I read it. And then that moment you talk about with feeling who we are in our body. Are you a tight sort of collagen, sort of muscle bound person, or are you relaxed?
I'm an elastinous person.
Yeah, that was good because I see examples of that in all different ways, from people who are very sensitive to pain, or people who really have a natural fight response. Like Deb Dana, who's another polyvagal person, talks a lot about what's your home away from home, and which is her way of saying what's your natural response to stress. And some people it's a fight response, and other people it's a dissociative response. So parasympathetic, sympathetic.
And so one way to talk about that is like your dominance as well, like you're sympathetically dominant or you're parasympathetically dominant, which is something I learned from Nicholas Gonzalez and also from Vincent Medici via one of my mentors, Ellen Heed. So what a lot of people don't know is that we're born with connective tissue density, and connective tissue is made of collagen and elastin fibers and some proportion of those things. And that's largely due to where our ancestors came from and our need to store fat, because elastinous tissue stores fat more easily. There's more space between the fibers of the connective tissue. And each of those types of connective tissue predispose us towards certain nervous system responses based on how fast electrochemical signals are traveling through the nerves, through the fascia. So that was a huge breakthrough for me in understanding myself and healing myself from my own birth trauma, or the trauma that I had from giving birth, was that I realized how not only I was already parasympathetically dominant and I have elastinous connective tissue. Even just today, this little girl was showing me that she could do center splits, and I don't do yoga regularly anymore at all. And I saw her do it, and she was like, and some people can lay their belly on the floor. And I thought, I can do that. And I just got down in center splits and laid my stomach flat on the floor without having quote unquote stretched for years. So, if you have a tendency towards elastinous tissue and then you do elastin exercises, like you stretch a lot, and then in my case was a vegetarian, so not eating collagen in my food, I didn't realize I was really predisposing myself towards prolapse. And it's a lot harder to get those sympathetic responses kind of congealed and intact. Mm-hmm. So I find that it can really help people put pieces together of when they're trying to heal, like, well, what is the source? How, like, is this a nervous system thing? Is this a biomechanical thing? Is this a biochemical thing? Mm-hmm. So it's really important to know what our default responses are so that we have, we can locate ourselves and know, oh, I tend towards this. Mm-hmm. So maybe I could do this other thing. Like for me, at this point in my life, it's really helpful for me to lift weights and do more flexor oriented activity that's making my tissue denser, because that supports me in power and drive and healthy differentiation and feeling more solid in myself. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And what we see is a lot of this stuff is brought to us from men, and men tend to have more collagen anyway. And then the sympathetic responses, which are irritation on an emotional level, irritation, frustration, anger, and rage, those are acceptable responses for most men to have. And most women, it's acceptable for us to have the, panic, worry, sadness, or the disorientation, confusion, collapse. And I'm talking about like white overculture, and it doesn't map onto every single culture. But then, as we know, when you run the same grooves all the time, those are the grooves that you're more likely to get into.
Right. Well, that's a really good explanation. That first chapter does have a lot of really good stuff in it around the polyvagal theory and the autonomic nervous system. And some of the things that people really enjoyed about your podcast with Stephen Porges were all around fawning and the please and appease response. So I'm wondering if you could recap a little bit for the people that are listening, because that was really engaging for people. And some people don't even know about the please and appease response or the fawn response. So
sure.
Yeah.
So one of the parts of polyvagal theory that changed the way that we've thought about the nervous system, one of them was that the parasympathetic system isn't just a rest and digest system, and that we're mixing apples and oranges to say fight or flight and rest and digest. But the other part, one of the other parts was that, okay, parasympathetic system, the dorsal branch under threat, which is the back branch, leads us towards freeze or collapse. And then in the social nervous system branch, the ventral vagal, we also have different responses. And a lot of what you see out there for models, like the ladder, the stoplight, is always like social is good, and so it's green. And then sympathetic is medium, so it's yellow. And then parasympathetic, bad, so it's red. And I really don't think that model serves us for many reasons. One of it being that it makes it seem like we should always be in green, and none of us are always in what's been labeled green, but also because it doesn't show the flip side, which is, first of all, if you are thinking that parasympathetic is rest and digest or fluid release or arousal, then you would want to be in a parasympathetic state. When you go to bed, you'd like to be parasympathetic so you can sleep. So It's definitely not red. And it's just all mixed up in terms of where safety is and where threat is.
Right.
So in the social nervous system, just like in the sympathetic nervous system, I mean, people who are listening have the basic skeleton of this, right?
No, I think so.
Yes. Yeah. So in the sympathetic system, we know that under threat, we either approximate the threat, fight it, or we move away from the threat and flee it. In the social nervous system, we have a similar thing where if we are under threat, we can approximate it, which is fawning. We can get closer to it. We can be nice. We can, it's safer for us to have that threat close to us because it's a known factor than to have the threat out there roaming around. And it doesn't have to be what I was trying to get at with Porges. It's funny because someone said, well, you fawned Porges. Really, it was more that I have a lot of respect for his work, and he has a lot to teach. And I knew that there was only so much time that I had. And I felt that I was starting to waste the listener's time by trying to continue to get him to answer something that clearly isn't really his interest or isn't in his wheelhouse or just not. And that's actually one of the main reasons I wanted to have him on, is because I had heard him before paraphrasing this fawn thing. He calls it a superpower. And he says that he uses these really extreme examples of women who get kidnapped and then have babies with their captor and then stay with them. And he seems to think that it's impossible to feign a fawning response because it's happening on a deeper subconscious level. But I think that is a way of avoiding structural power and a conversation around structural power, because most of the biggies in trauma have a lot of structural power. And so I don't know if they're actually able to see it from a point of view of people who live in positions that are not. So working with so many women, my first book was on motherhood, and it had a lot of information about trauma and healing from a difficult birth, is that these responses of fawning and fitting in, when you talk to women about it, it's like we're experts at them, and we all know how much or how little that we're dancing in that space. And also, you know, race and equality are extreme priorities for me, and I see them happening in how racial dynamics play out. So for instance, if you're in a place of less structural power and you're fawning in the racial dialectic, that's called Uncle Tomming. It's called code switching. It's when you make a phone call and you change your voice because the person is going to serve you better if you're speaking to them differently. Now, someone might say, well, that's your conscious choice. And any conscious choice is not what we're talking about in the autonomic nervous system. But I don't agree, because it becomes a habit and it's learned over time, and you know you're going to get positive reinforcement from it. So after a while, you don't even know what it is that you're diminishing sometimes, because, or, you know, you can think about it of like the stereotypical second wave feminism is like you dress, talk, and act like the men in power so that you can have access to that space. But we also see it, I mean, I've done it before. I can give a million examples of times when I've done it, and done it consciously and unconsciously. And then the other side is fitting in. Fitting in is what I would consider to be assimilation. You erase the differences that make you different so that you don't, so that you, number one, can belong, but also so that you can have access. And that can look like, that's where imposter syndrome lives, is these questions around belonging. So normally when you hear like the vagus nerve is all the rage, right? And you hear like, oh yeah, you know, calm the vagus nerve, you're going to downstroke your heart, and then you're going to do this and you're going to hum. None of those things are bad. They're just really not taking into account that, number one, downregulating your system isn't often what most women need specifically. We need to learn how to hold charge and tolerate conflict specifically. So I think that there needs to be a lot more attention paid to the fitting in and fawning responses.
I think that when I hear you talk, when I hear you explain these things, when I read them in your book, especially in the field of obstetrics and maternity care, it's one of the big concerns that we have amongst women, is to help them really feel that tone in their body. And often there'll be a compliance that is read as compliance, but it's really a freeze place with women in childbirth. It can be misread a lot by staff, by doctors, and helping women feel like, often it's just the women will report to me, I just saw myself totally do what they told me to do. It's a somewhat of a survival response, but I think that it's incumbent upon us to recognize these patterns in women and help them. So when you say hold charge, just before we go back to the fitting in and the please and appease, what does it look like for a woman to hold charge, Kimberly?
Well, I think it's like we just went from like a woman inside a birth situation who's noticing that she's complied probably later on, or maybe as it's happening, from an ability to hold charge. What it looks like is, I mean, it looks differently in a lot of different tiers, but it's a sense of agency. It's what I consider to be animal jaguar energy. It's our wildness. And as you mentioned before we were recording, a lot of times when we're in our power, then we're judged by the overculture to be difficult, to be bitchy, to be aggressive, ambitious, right? All of those things. And we might have that internalized. So actually people might not even be reacting to us that way, but that's what we're afraid of in ourselves. And so we don't know ourselves, right? It's like learning boundaries, which this has everything to do with. When you learn boundaries, if you're not used to having them, it can feel mean. People tell me that all the time, but it's mean. Well, differentiating isn't mean. Differentiating is sovereignty, but it could feel that way if you're used to always saying yes to everything and going along with everyone else's agenda for you, whether that's your parents or your relationship or a hospital or whatever. So holding charge is like, I can stand my ground and I know what's true for me. And in the face of, you know, these days there's no shortage of opportunities to learn how to be with conflict or charge. It doesn't mean being hard. It doesn't mean not taking into account your environment or the outer world. In fact, it means being very much in relationship to the outer world. But I see a lot of women who give away their power, specifically when it comes to their pelvis, and it surprises them. But because we don't look at things a lot of the times from a nervous system perspective, we don't understand, for instance, that anesthetic is a freeze state. And so even if you need the anesthesia for whatever reason, it's still going to put you into a more parasympathetic state. So if you have a history of freeze responses, whether that's because you had a domineering parent or even a violent parent, or because you have a past history of trauma, or because you've been a long time meditator and you know how to have no preference and stay in a freeze state, then when you're under anesthesia, when you and I are working with women who are like, I don't know why I didn't say this or didn't say that, it's like, well, you already had parasympathetic predispositions, and then you're in a power dynamic where you need that doctor to like you to a certain degree so that you can get good care. Right. And then on top of that, you're under anesthesia. No wonder you couldn't say anything. Right. And so giving someone a way to understand that usually filters into their system where it lifts a level of shame or blame so that there can be repair, right? Because that shame, which is also a parasympathetic state, tends to keep us immobilized in parts of ourselves back in the past that we're trying to get more current.
Right. Good. Yeah. So there's people now starting to pop up on Facebook Live. I'm going to say to people, if you have questions or comments, please put them down. We're live now. So if anyone would like to ask a question, please go ahead and post it in the comments beneath our discussion. And we're discussing The Call of the Wild with Kimberly and Johnson. And yeah, there's the book. And I think I put already in a lot of the places where I go, how to get the first chapter. We're talking about the first chapter, and we're going to just go back for a second. So in the first chapter, you have some really nice images. They're just very simple, mapping out some of these places. Now, the fitting in fawning, the camouflage response, that's a parasympathetic response. But if I understood some of what Stephen Porges was saying, the please and appease is a sympathetic response, right? Which one is it, Kimberly? Is this sort of, fawning or please and appease? Is it parasympathetic or is it a sympathetic response? Can you answer that mysterious question?
I can say how I look at it, and my frameworks are based on learning from John and Anna Chitty, learning from Peter Levine. I've studied Porges's work, but I haven't actually studied with him. And then what I've learned from being a Rolfer, and then also just from my own personal healing experiences. And then I did this insane thing where in 3 years I did 800 sessions, and I did hands-on, hands-in work. So I do internal pelvic floor work together with trauma tracking. So I'm not a researcher. I don't go in the lab and isolate certain nerves and look and see what they innervate. I do study anatomy, and not so much cranial anatomy, but I do know something about it, but I'm not speaking from that point of view. Ultimately, I think that it's part of the ventral vagal system. That's what it seems, since the ventral vagal system, which to me is part of the parasympathetic branch because it's part of the ventral branch of the vagus nerve. For me, since that evolved from maternal bonding, which we know evolutionarily, phylogenetically, that's how the social nervous system evolved. And the social nervous system, sometimes people think that we're being like Homo sapiens centric by talking about it. I agree wholeheartedly that animals, birds have intense social structures, far more advanced than a lot of the ones that we have as Homo sapiens. And yet they don't have the same social nervous system that developed for the maternal dyad, that developed so that we would take care of these young that depend on us for so freaking long. And so in that cueing system of a baby, a mother knowing how a baby is, a baby then being mirrored, and that being part of our survival instinct, that's based on estrogen and oxytocin. So the social nervous system is where the oxytocin circuitry is. And it is also where estrogen is. So estrogen predisposes us towards social networks, towards knowing and perceiving how other people feel. Talk to any menopausal woman who's like, fuck it, I'm moving and y'all can make yourself dinner, right? Like you just, once your estrogen stops dropping, you stop caring as much about fitting in and fawning. It starts to become less a part of your default mechanism. So within the social nervous system, that's how it registers to me and what I watch in other people. But ultimately, I'm like, I don't know how much it matters, because to me, this is all about loving each other more and being able to be more humane. So where we categorize it, I'm not sure how much it matters, as long as we know, especially as practitioners, where to move from that and what to do with it, and what to do with it in ourselves when it arises. But I'm pretty sure, I mean, isn't fawning already part of the documentation in terms of a parasympathetic ventral vagal response?
We've had multiple discussions about what it actually is, and differentiating from fawning between pleasing and appeasing. I understood the please and appease to be more of a sympathetic, a mixed state, social and sympathetic. That's how I understood it from
But
studying.
basically like a dysfunctional, because usually the intersection, the overlay of the band between social and sympathetic is normally where there's play and the ability for spontaneity and the ability for a receptivity together with energy for it.
Mhm.
So
Yeah, I understood it to be a mixed state, social and the fawning. I'm not so sure, since I've stopped sort of orienting to fawning. But I understood that camouflage and fitting in is more parasympathetic, if that's the same thing. It's camouflaging is a threat response that's parasympathetic. That's how I understood it, and that's how I teach it. But I think
you see that as a parasympathetic dorsal,
yeah, I do.
rather than a parasympathetic ventral.
Yeah. Well, that's a really good question. I think if you do it as a threat response and a stress response without consciousness, it's a dorsal, not a ventral. But if you do it consciously, then I think it could be quite ventral, depending on what, see, it's complex.
Yeah, see, I think we don't really know, because that's basically what Porges was saying, was like, well, fawning is this sophisticated response, and he's saying that it's involuntary. So I think that's what we're talking about, is like, well, does the fact that it's voluntary then make it social, rather than it has to be, if it's involuntary, it can't be social. Whereas in my experience, going through a full cascade, I have behaved in all of those ways in a full circuit and had it complete itself. And then not noticed until after that that's what I was doing. So like the example that comes to mind is, I had a boyfriend, and I grew up in an alcoholic family, and I don't do well around addiction. And he wasn't drinking, but he would drink like every 6 weeks, and then he would drink to blackout, and he would come to my house. And so, it was known between us, like this was supposed to be something that was stopping, and we had support in place so that would stop. And it was very obvious what his triggers were that were leading him there. He was a super sympathetically charged person, a really big abandonment trigger when his children would go from his house to his former spouse's house. And it would usually, then he was a triathlete and a lawyer and
Wow.
just like doing all this high charge things. And then the lid would come off the pressure cooker and he would drink to blackout. So he came to my house, blacked out like at, 5 a.m. or something. And I was super confused. So at first was confusion, like parasympathetic, like what's going on? Could this be real? This can't be real. He knows that I told him like, this can't happen anymore. Why is he at my house? My daughter's in the other room. I can't handle this, right? Like a child response to the alcohol, even though I think he even said like I was partying at this place. And then it was like, oh, you're blacked out. And he's like, okay, I should leave. And then I'm going, well, I don't really want him to leave and drive anywhere because I don't want someone else to be in danger. But at the same time, that would actually be the healthy boundary to say like, just deal with your own self. Don't come in here. But because I was like, also didn't want that to be the reality because I didn't want to end the relationship in my rational mind. It was like, okay, then come and just get in bed with me and go to sleep. So then we go to sleep, wake up the next morning. I'm still like, I'm starting to get really, really mad. Like, what the fuck? How could you put me in danger like this? How could you put our kids in danger? How could you drive here? All those things. But then again, swing up to social, but I love this person and I don't want there to be a rupture, but what am I doing? And then, oh, okay, now we're going to have sex because if I have sex, maybe I'll prove it to myself that things are okay. So I'm going to like try to connect, which is a form of fawning. Like, okay, here, I'm going to now offer myself to this and see if I can make it okay. And then of course he was probably so confused by the whole thing. And then that's finished. And then all of a sudden it was like, yeah, you do need to go home and you need to leave here. And so it's like a full cascade. So these aren't just things that happen like only in high stakes situation. I mean, there's a lot of clients I have that are in fawning most of the time, and they're definitely not choosing it. And you could say, oh, some people say, well, it's because they're first having the flight response and covered over the flight response is this behavior, but they're not choosing that behavior. That's their learned behavior that is like to act like a lap dog. And unless you're acting like a lap dog, you're not going to be safe or valued, or you can't have your own needs and still be accepted.
Right. The whole story feels complex and amazingly like familiar in some respects, because a lot of us have had to do behaviors around, should I stay connected? Should I not stay connected? And some of the things that you talked about in terms of the please and appease or fawning, like I think that Poor just called it a superpower. And for those of us who grew up in disorganized attached homes, where
I mean, to me, that feels insulting, honestly. Like when I hear that, I'm like, a superpower. Like,
yeah, I was
only
going
someone who's never had to do that could say that.
right.
Because
Right.
there's just a million examples of anyone who's not either female or non-white in position or just younger. When you don't have that level of structural power, it's not a choice that you make.
Right.
That's your survival strategy.
Absolutely.
The superpower is our ability. This is what I think most females kind of get wrong, because our culture is so dominant towards sympathetic responses. Like our culture loves the healthy sympathetic, which is just like drive, don't stop, keep producing, keep going. We get tons of accolades for being in that mode. And the fact that our superpower as females, the estrogenous superpower is our ability to perceive. And in a way, it's also a parasympathetic superpower, is that parasympathetically dominant people are more connected to universal reality. Sympathetically dominant people are more connected to this material reality. Mm-hmm. So we need people in both camps. And we also need people with estrogen that are aware of what's happening to the other people around them and very attuned to that. That's how we've kept our collective groups safe. But it turns against us when we're in fawning and fitting in all the time instead of in belonging, which of course social media has just like put some lighter fuel on and made that response just way more blown up.
Mm-hmm. Right.
But that's a superpower, but it's not a superpower anymore when you don't have access to your own power, because you're in comparison and appeasement all the time.
Right. No, I get it. It feels so good to have you name these things, Kimberly. I mean, I think that's why people resonate so much with your messaging and the things that you have to say and the way you say them, because they're just to have them named in the space. It gives a sense of not only like real feeling to what goes on for, especially for women or people of color or people who've been put into situations where they've had to fawn or please and appease to survive. It just really helps to have you name the experience and the confusion of it. And if people can begin to wrap their minds around what their personal experience is, and then you can give them tools to help decompress and then integrate experiences, and then have the power of choice to say, in this situation, I'm going to turn on that, that social dominant or that please and appease or that drive or that parasympathetic power that I have to perceive. So it feels very good to have this broken down in
so
name.
maybe please and appease and fawning are just different. Like, I guess I probably should do more research about, like, because I know some people use the language tend and befriend also. Because to me, when I hear that please and appease, or like some people would just call it manipulation, right? Like some people would just straight up call that manipulating. And I understand, actually, someone asked me that in a class once. And at the time, I don't think I really understood. And then after the class was over, I was like, oh, that's what that person was getting at. Because when you're on the receiving end of fawning, that's not easy either, right? Like that's a place where I'm finding myself a lot right now, and trying to figure out, well, what do you do when you're when you're the person that has the structural power? Now all these people are looking to me because I wrote a book thinking that I'm going to have all these answers, and then projecting a whole bunch of stuff onto me, and then coming into session thinking that these things. So as practitioners, what do we do when people are fawning us?
Well,
and what do we get out of that? Because I mean, essentially that's what we've seen happen is a lot of people who've benefited a lot from fawning, and those being the teachers, which that's why I'm not surprised at all that there's so much confusion here, because just like with sexuality, so many of the teachers actually they haven't contended with power at all themselves. And so, I mean, I am waiting, Kate, find the male interviewer, find that male interviewer for me, who's, instead of going to focus on me and my trauma, tell me I did it instead of me too. Find that person. I haven't found it yet. I'm about to turn the tables on some of the people interviewing me to just flat out ask, because I'm like, how are we ever going to move the dialogue forward if there's not space for that? And I'm not even making a moral statement about it. I just want to know if almost every woman that I've ever met has dealt with harassment, assault, and abuse, that means that most of the men have been the assaulters or the abusers. And I have all the space in the world to come together on equal ground and actually work it out, but not by hiding or protecting someone else either.
Well, so it's a real call to consciousness is what you're asking.
Yeah.
And there are 2 points that you made with Stephen Porges, and we'll complete with these for our live broadcast for today, unless you have other things you want to say. He talked about disarming the space by taking the word doctor off of his name. Like he said, so my answer to that question is, how can we, is another question, how can we disarm the space? How can we just say, okay, by just naming, okay, well, I have a certain amount of white privilege, having had the middle class white uprising doesn't mean my life is trauma free, but it's nowhere near the experience of a woman of color in this country, or an immigrant, or anybody who's had to really struggle in the face of really direct macroaggressions and threats because of the color of your skin. There are things like that we can begin just to start to disarm the space. And then, I forgot the other point I was going to make, because Stephen Porges, he made some pretty interesting remarks about please and appease and fawning. Oh, it was your question about sex hormones. Can we bring this discussion of sex hormones more into the space as well? And you're the first person I think I've heard talk about estrogen dominant, as opposed to, just a more female or social connectivity. Estrogen is a part of that. So I thought that was a really good question. Like, how can we acknowledge that those of us who are estrogen dominant have more tendency towards connectivity or not? So I thought those are the two things I would say. How do we disarm the space, have there be more sovereignty, which I loved that you used that word early in our broadcast, because that feels good. How can I maintain my sovereignty in the face of challenge? So
So for disarming the space, everyone has to reckon with that themselves in terms of like what your field is, right? So I'm not a psychologist. I don't have a master's in social work. I'm not even a massage therapist. So I'm not operating in a scope of practice, which leaves me to be very, very free to define how it is that I want to work, meaning that I can self-disclose. So I can talk about my own life. I can talk about who I am and the struggles that I have, just like I did in this conversation, talking about a past relationship. That's an example of disarming the space. I'm not coming here separating my professional self and my personal self and telling you from my brain some bullet points about things. I'm telling you from my lived experience, which is a way of redefining authority. And I think that's ultimately what we're talking about. How do we confer authority? Who has authority? White bodies have traditionally been the people holding authority. So the white body is the standard to which all other bodies are measured. So if you're inhabiting a white body, then you need to know that, and you need to do what's necessary to disarm the space by naming it. And then it really kind of depends on you and what your lane is and what your work is to do. And I think that that's really important for people to know, is that we all don't have the same work to do. We all don't have to be in the same lane. We just need to define what it is we're doing and who it is that we are serving. I also don't want to make Porges into like a straw man or whatever you call that in debate, because I really was honored to have him, and I'm not fawning right now. I think it's very important to honor the work. I mean, polyvagal theory, like holy shit, like what a contribution to all of the work that I've learned and everything that I've done. So I've never even studied with him. So I don't really know about his reckoning with power. I just know how he responded to those questions. And I know that I already came into it, I was hoping that there would be something that would maybe shake loose, or just sort of, I was hoping we would like think about it together, just sort of like how you and I are doing, like, let's just think through this. But what I realized is he even said himself, I'm taking off my researcher hat and I'm putting on my relational hat. And I think for him to wrestle with an idea, he would probably only do that with another researcher. I don't think he's really interested in doing that with someone like me. But if people who are listening haven't listened to the podcast, I think there's a lot to learn there. And I was very moved by when I asked him, do you think you're a master regulator? And he said, no, because I've met those master regulators. And I said, well, what regulates you? And he did not give a stock answer. He didn't say, oh, the ocean regulates me, or he did say, I'm married and da. But he said it's the people who he never imagined teaching, which were trauma therapists. He's a researcher. He didn't think he would have this impact in a clinical setting. And then women who were able to receive him as a positive masculine and were able to receive and co-regulate with him because they developed trust with him, which I thought was like really beautiful. And I don't believe in historical revisionism. So I don't expect people, including my parents, although I do talk with them a lot about all of the things we're talking about, I don't expect them to adopt the current language to have all the right terms. I can still relate to what it is that they are conveying. And I think with Porges, I just recognize, okay, I have so much to learn from him, and he's so crystal clear on so many things. Then this just isn't the piece that's his to do. So like, let's evolve that. And hopefully he'll see that as an evolution, but it doesn't really matter, I guess. So that's what I think about that. And I'm really radically opposed, funny to be radically opposed to polarity, but my mission is that we can be humane and human with each other in all of our differences. And that's really why I think the social nervous system is important at this point in time, is because we're at a moment where everyone's separating more and needing safety and homogeneity. And I get it and I understand. And I'm hoping that as a culture in the next 5 or 10 years, that we will have established that safety in the homogeneity and we can come back together with acknowledgements of structural power in place and be able to evolve to a new level of belonging altogether, where it doesn't require all of these adaptive social responses to even be together. Because that's what's happening in my world, is everyone's internalized, unmetabolized fight or flight responses are turning into moral outrage that's turning into social media competitions that have nothing to do with just people and like just actually telling each other our stories, being with each other, acknowledging our humanity. And it's just going to take a long time, but that's my hope for the book, really, is that the people with less structural power are unshamed by their physiological responses that are not voluntary. That's why I'm just like, I just can't accept that please and appease, if that's the same as fawning, is entirely voluntary, because it invalidates most of the people that I work with. But you know, I'm also willing to be wrong, and I don't think I have the full picture, so I'm willing to learn. And I mean, that's a hard thing about writing a book, is you write it and then it's there, and then you know, but you can change your mind and maybe we'll find out more things, because it's only been 25 years that we've had polyvagal theory and it's evolving all the time.
Well, I think you are evolving the work. I mean, I think that to be able to bring some of this discussion about sex and about birth and about motherhood into the space, which is how we met. And also just to say, to like, one of your arguments, which I love, there's so much about what you bring that I love, is just to make sex a much more positive place for us to have a conversation. You called it a blue, when we used to use the blue and red to represent the blueprint and the imprint. But, you know, just to have more, I don't know, different types of conversations that aren't so black and white or so disparate. And also, like, there is a place for this feminine discussion, this female sex, the estrogen and other dominance that comes into play, especially for a safe birth or a good birth or connection with your baby or connection with your partner. And how does that play a role in the overall health of our people? Because that's the roots of all of our health, are often laid down in this early first relationship. So I do think you're evolving the work.
Thank you.
It takes courage to be standing up here in front of everyone with what it is that you have to say. So thank you so much for coming on live with me today, Kimberly.
Yeah, thank you. This has been fun.
And we have a webinar coming up for
Next week,
next
the
Monday.
5th.
Monday,
Yep,
yes.
week from tomorrow.
And wherever I posted this live feed, I'll go find it and put the link. But there's other things that you're doing. So how can people find you? Is it through your website? And
yeah, I have a new website. If you were listening, and you might know me as Magamama, but now I'm my birth name, which is KimberlyAnnJohnson.com. And you can get the first chapter free there, KimberlyAnnJohnson.com/chapter. We're going to have a book club. So the day after the book releases, which is April 13th, I'll lead the inaugural book club, which is a way, I mean, I don't know how the people feel that are listening to this, but I feel that we're moving into a space where one-on-one work isn't enough, because there's just not enough practitioners to do the work, even if we train a lot of people. And we're in such a highly stressful time that it's kicked to the surface a lot of the underlying traumas and stressors. So we need a forum to be together, and a book club is one of those forums, but I'm going to be leading the first one so that I can really set the stage for how I want them to go. And I've taken a lot of care in making a very comprehensive discussion guide, which is also a way of learning how to speak sensation language and do the kind of tracking that we know how to do as practitioners, but that we should be empowering our clients to be able to do on their own, and that we can do with each other.
right. Okay, well, find Kimberly on her website, find Pre and Perinatal Healing online. That's where we're going to be doing this webinar, and I'll place more information in the comments below. So
Thank you.
thank you for joining us on this this wonderful ride, the call of the wild.